We are going to now have one of our workshop sessions, so obviously there are 3 to choose from. We're absolutely delighted that you lot have chosen to come to this one. That's terrific. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is invite my 4 workshopees, if there is such a word, to join me on the stage, and then we'll begin our hopefully freewheeling discussion. So as before, be patient with me. Let me introduce all 4 of them onto the stage and then give them all a very warm round of applause. So we've got Justus Wesseler, who is a professor at Wageningen University. He has the chair in agricultural economics and rural policy. He's an expert in sustainability and bioeconomics. We've got Silvia Nanni, who is a senior policy analyst at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We're also joined by Goulay, who is Sustainable Innovation Senior Manager at the Kering Group. And we are also joined by Eleni Zika, who many of you will know is Head of Program at the BBIJU. So please give all 4 of them a very warm welcome. Up you come, you 4. And see, there is no real seating plan, but choose a seat that you like the look of and make yourselves at home. Now, I should say, everybody, that we're very much addressing the issue of sustainability, and particularly the SDGs, the sustainability goals set by the UN in the next phase of hopefully transforming the planet into a greener, more sustainable place for us all to live. And we're discussing the role of bio-based innovation in the sustained international effort to deliver on sustainability targets. So it's a very important topic, and it's one that obviously business has to care about now. It's obviously at governmental level, it's become increasingly a priority. We see it in the European Union, and we hope we see it around the world as well in terms of policymakers and policy making. So what we're going to do is get the perspectives, different perspectives of our panel, but unlike before, it's not going to be formal where everybody goes to the lectern and makes a 10 or 15-minute speech. We're hoping that the presentations will be short and sweet, and ladies and gentlemen, you can stay in your chairs to deliver them, so we create an atmosphere where you guys can then, I hope, raise points, thoughts, questions. We've got about an hour, so we've got much more time for your questions, your thoughts to be aired in this session. And to be honest, I don't want to do so much of the questioning. I want you lot to do it if you possibly are prepared to do so. One final point I'll make before we begin. I have to say, it is wonderful to have a female majority panel, because it doesn't happen so often. Today it hasn't happened before, and I do a lot of conferences, and there are far too many manels, as they call them, male-based panels. So I'm delighted that this is not a manel. So in that spirit, why don't we, I have no particular order, but Christine, give us your opening thoughts.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and thank you to the BBI for inviting me to be here. So as mentioned, I work for the Kering Group. I'm curious, I can't really see very well, but how many of you are familiar with the Kering Group? If you can raise your hand if you are. Okay, big hand.
Well, I'll be honest, I wasn't. So
a couple people. So I think I'm one of the, if not the only apparel brand who's here today. So the Kering Group is a group of luxury brands, both soft and hard luxury. So our portfolio of houses includes Gucci, Saint Laurent, Alexander McQueen, Balenciaga, Bottega Veneta, jewelry watch brands like Boucheron, Pomellato, Ulysse Nardin. So we're about a $14 billion company in revenue. We have about 30,000 employees worldwide. And we have a very strong sustainability ethos thanks to our chairman and CEO, François-Henri Pinault. And so for many years, we've been really looking deep into different sustainability issues. And last year, maybe the year before, I think it was January 2017, we released our strategy for 2025 for sustainability, and it's called Crafting Tomorrow's Luxury. Within this strategy, there are 3 pillars. The first is care, so this is everything that has to do with the environment. The second is collaborate, and this is focused on people, the people within our company and in the supply chains for our the goods that we're making. And the third is create, which is focused on innovation and new business models. Now, care, the environmental pillar, is something where we've been very strong because we developed an environmental profit and loss. So basically, we looked at the impacts of our business along the entire value chain, from raw material to final product, and along different indicators, air pollution, water use, GHG emissions, CO2, and land use. We basically said, if we had to write a check to Mother Nature for all of the impact that our business is having on the world, what would the amount of that check be? So we take these impacts and we turn it into a monetary value. And within our strategy for 2025, we have a very ambitious goal to reduce the amount of our EP&L by 40%. This is based on science-based targets and keeping the world within the 2 degrees promised at the Paris climate talks. So that's how we came up with the 40%. We have other targets to reduce our CO2 emissions by 50%. And we actually just went out and became made a commitment to become carbon neutral across our entire supply chain in the last couple months. But for this EP&L, I don't want to take too long, but I think it's important to give you some context. It shows that 93% of our impact is outside of our own operation. It's outside of our offices and our stores. It's within our supply chain. And almost 70% of that impact is at tier 4, the raw material stage. So these farmers who are producing and growing the cotton or the leather or the gold that we're extracting, that's where the impact is. And that's why it's very important for not only us, but all other apparel brands to be really looking at the bio-based economy. And seeing how we can look to other resources in order to make sure that we're not, ruining the planet, basically. Because another statistic that's very interesting is, I don't know if you know what kind of material you're wearing, but now 65% of all clothing is polyester, so petroleum-based. Which is kind of insane when you think about it. We're really losing a lot of these natural fibers, which we don't want to lose, but we want to make sure there are good biosynthetics that we can look to as well. So we have a number of strategies. I'll go into those maybe a little bit later, but just to give you a little bit of context on why it's important for apparel companies to be looking to this, and we are, as a group. I think it's becoming a real focus. So happy to speak more about it.
Christine, that's terrific. Thank you. And it's great to start with somebody in business who clearly is taking this very seriously. We've obviously got researchers and thinkers and analysts on the panel as well. So, Eleni, I won't go to you next because I'll have you give us a BBI overview at the end. But perhaps Silvia, you could give us your perspective now. You're at the European Environmental Policy Institute. So give us your thoughts on this subject.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks again to the BBI-JU for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here as well, and provide our perspective, as we said, more in terms of the research, but also the thinking around the bioeconomy and how this could be developed in the future as well, and how we can, as researchers and thinkers, how we can support also industry and public administration as well in developing the bioeconomy going forward. We are the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We just turned 40 a couple of years ago, so we are well established in Europe as well and in Brussels. And in terms of the bioeconomy, we do collaborate quite closely with the BBI-JU and also the big secretariat. At the moment, we are developing a project very much on trying to understand what are the data and information needed from the projects, and also what type of methodology and method we need to put in place, or projects in particular and business need to put in place in order to assess their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals and to sustainability more generally, which is something that is very much needed at this stage, where the SDGs are obviously a European but also an international goal that we need to achieve, but there is still quite a lot of room for improving the measurements and how, more specifically, business can communicate, but also can measure in a practical terms their contribution to the SDGs. So part of our contribution today will start from that perspective, and we think there is a lot of room for bio-based sector and the economy more generally to obviously do provide positive contribution, and it's already so, obviously, it's been so for years as well, but we do need to actually be also a bit more practical and understand how we can actually do this in quantitative terms and how this can be also communicated to the wider world as well.
Okay, great. Well, Silvia, thank you. And Justus, we'll go straight to you. You have this chair professorship in agricultural economics and rural policy. So give us your perspective on this debate.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I also like to thank the organizers, and in particular Philippe, for setting up this event and organizing this panel. I'm very happy to be part of this. In addition to my position as being the Professor for Agricultural Economics and Rural Policy at Wageningen University, I'm also the coordinator of an EU-funded project under Horizon 2020, which is called Biomonitor. And what we do within this project is try to improve the information availability with respect to the performance of the bioeconomy. So what we do in particular is trying to fill up some data gaps that have been observed. And in particular, we try to expand the database for what we call bio-based products, products that are processed from biological resources but not used for food and feed. And that basically are the products that we are discussing here today and that have been mentioned by many of the speakers from the private sector already. Now, providing this additional information will then allow us also to assess how successful the policy environment is for stimulating the development of the bioeconomy. So for this, we then use this information and develop models to also forecast what may happen in the future. And one of the relevant aspects then is also to what extent the development of the bioeconomy can contribute to sustainable development. And I think that is then maybe has a link with the activities of IEEP. There are also some other important issues, and that have been raised by the stakeholders, and some of the stakeholders that have participated in some of the workshops we organized, I have seen here already. That is the importance of the bioeconomy for the development of rural areas. And I think that is one of the very important issues when we look at what is happening in Europe, when we look how rural areas are now performing. There are a number of concerns with current developments that are related to outmigration, that are related to sustainability issues in rural areas, service supplies, etc. And there we can see, there we think that the bioeconomy can make a positive contribution for rural development. But for being able to say something concrete about this, we also need to have a more solid database available, and that is what we will provide within our project. What we do beyond what basically is done by others as well is that we also look into the innovative capacity within the European Union. I think that is where our project contributes something new to the current debate. So we try to assess the amount of public and private sector level investments in the bioeconomy, and also try to assess the performance measured by, for example, patent applications within the European Union. And this gives us perhaps a good indicator about how the development of the bioeconomy may look like in 5 to 10 years. And as I have already mentioned, we use this then in our models to forecast what may happen. And I leave this at this stage, and then later I'm happy to get involved in the discussion and answering hopefully interesting questions. Thank you very much.
I hope so, yeah. All right, well, in this phase then of just opening remarks, Eleni, obviously you're with BBI-JU, so give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so first of all, good afternoon to everyone. And some of you I can't see because I have blinding lights in my face, so apologies if I look like I'm smudging my face. Welcome again from my side as well. And what I wanted to say, for those of you who may not be perhaps fully aware with what BBI's objectives are, is that sustainability is actually very much embedded in our raison d'etre. So it is part of who we are and what we were created for. So we are actually investing in research and innovation. I should say more innovation, because we're really trying to push the deployment at full scale so that we can create sustainable bio-based, new value chains, and so that we can drive economic growth in an equitable manner, in a way also that doesn't harm the environment, or actually rather even preserves or even enhances the environment and biodiversity, etc. So we want to, as part of the broader bioeconomy strategy, actually make sure we can create a resource-efficient society that is also low carbon. And so in that respect, we've started thinking about, and also as our portfolio has started to mature, how we can actually measure our contributions towards sustainability and the SDGs more concretely. And as part of our annual survey towards our projects, where we try to monitor through a number of KPIs their performance and their impact, we've started asking as well, what are their expected contributions toward SDGs? And so we've started to gather this information. It's still very qualitative, and we very much rely on work like the one already discussed briefly by Silvia and our big colleagues on how we can actually make such quantitative analysis more concrete and robust so that we can all apply them in the same way. So I can talk to you a little bit about the findings of our first analysis in terms of our contributions towards SDGs, but I really wanted to say just by existing, BBI is contributing in that direction very much. Well,
let's pick up on that then, now that we're going to get a debate going. Several of you have said measuring impacts is really important, and not necessarily a straightforward activity. You know, different people can measure in different ways, and they can read the results in different ways. And also then there's the question of whether the measurements applied in Europe are the same as the measurements applied in other parts of the world, because then you get into questions of sort of global competitiveness. So how difficult is this issue of measuring impacts right now? From, you know, the question, I suppose, is basically how sure can we be as outsiders that when people make claims for the sustainability of biomaterials, bioindustry activity, how sure can we be that the results are accurate and authentic?
Yeah, you want to comment first? Yeah.
Well, don't worry, there's going to be time for all of us, so.
Great, okay. Oh, sure. I mean, as I said, I think the bio-based sector is already contributing, and to some extent, qualitatively, there is already analysis ongoing, as we were saying, but on the other hand, I just wanted to point out another element beyond the, let's say, lack of data and information that probably it will come our way as well in the discussion. I was also going to make the point of the link between sort of impacts in Europe and impacts beyond Europe as well, and the global bio-based sector more generally, because obviously these discussions are quite relevant as well. And in the analysis we have been doing for BIC, but also beyond that analysis, there is a point to think about, which are spillover effects. So what's the impact of the bio-based economy in Europe, beyond Europe as well, and in the global sphere? And there are quite some impacts that are not factored currently into the indicators and the indicator set to assess, for example, progress toward the SDGs. I think this is a major, let's say, lack of, let's say, still understanding and data that we need to flag as researchers and thinkers as well, which should be actually quite importantly included into the current methodologies to assess the progress.
Justus, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, let me add a few things to this. I think there are some indicators that are relatively easy to assess, and these are indicators that are related, for example, turnover of the bioeconomy, jobs being created, etc. For this, we have relatively good statistics. We can fine-tune them a little bit more, but this is something that is straightforward to measure, and nevertheless very important to illustrate to many stakeholders. Now, when it comes to sustainability issues and environmental impacts, etc., there it becomes much more complicated. There we face a lot of uncertainty with respect also to the scientific knowledge that is currently available. Just think about measuring greenhouse gas emissions. There are so many factors that need to be taken into consideration. What do we know about the soils, etc., etc. So there's still a lot of scientific uncertainty related to this. This does not apply that one should not try to do this. But what I would say is we should be very careful with the interpretation of the data that we get with respect to wider environmental, greenhouse gas emission, sustainability indicators.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Christine, because you're in business, you talked about your big ambitions for Kering to, did I get it right, that you want to be carbon neutral very soon?
Yeah, we've made an announcement that we will be. So part of this will be carbon offsets.
Oh, so offsetting is part of that.
Offsetting is part of that.
Okay, yeah. but even to get close to that ambition, you have to be so confident of what's happening in your supply chains.
Right.
So number one, how confident can you be? I mean, how proactively are you monitoring your supply chains? And also, just in terms of materials, how can you be sure that, you know, you've got these very successful brands, how can you be sure that all the customers that, you know, are loyal to you are going to want to make the shift away from, you know, polyester or petrochemical-based products as quickly as you'd like them to?
Yeah, okay, so, yeah, interesting questions. For the first one, we're very proactive on trying to understand our supply chain. Within the apparel sector, as well as any company operating in the global supply chain today, it's very difficult because it's sort of designed to keep things anonymous in many ways. There are often traders in the middle, you don't know where things came from, et cetera. So in order to calculate any of these impacts, you first have to do a mapping and get visibility on what your supply chain is. Then in getting the data, that's also quite difficult.
And if sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
I think this is important, and it's something we talked about earlier. I mean, the clothing industry is kind of infamous for being quite secretive at times about its supply chains, partly because, you know, if you follow the supply chain all the way back, there are issues of labor standards, there are issues of materials and pollution and all sorts of things. So it's going to need a new mindset, and it may need companies such as yours to come together with rivals and competitors to set standards, new standards that really mean something. Can we, as outsiders, expect that to happen?
Yes, well, I think it already is happening in many respects. Within the apparel sector, there are different standards, voluntary standards that exist for many different things, for zero discharge of hazardous chemicals. So what do we come up with as a group of private sector companies in terms of what's okay to put in our product during processing, what's okay to put back into the wastewater stream. We also have multi-stakeholder working groups working on organic cotton, on viscose supply chains. I mean, there are a lot of things happening where there are standards that are in place for specific supply chains. There's also a huge amount of focus on traceability and transparency, which are two different things. So traceability is really being able to track your product through the entire supply chain from raw material all the way downstream. And then transparency, how much of that information are you revealing to who and what information is that going to be? At Kering, we have a target to have 100% traceability to the raw material level for 100% traceability for 100% of our key raw materials by 2025. So incredibly ambitious, considering, like I said, that a lot of these supply chains have agents, traders. It's really difficult because of the way they're designed. We have done partnerships. We actually just did a blockchain traceability pilot with other brands to trace organic cotton from the raw material to the final garment using different new technologies that exist. It's maybe going a little off stream, but using invisible fluorescent, synthetic DNA, microbiome in order to be able to tell, can we track this all the way through? So there are a lot of developments on this side that's helping with that. And I forget, you had a second question, but I forget what it was.
Well,
are people willing to pay or
yeah,
switch?
How do you, you know, when you balance out the priorities for the business, how important is your fear that customers might not want to move quite as fast as you'd like them to on some of these issues?
They don't have to know necessarily. I mean, luxury brands don't always communicate what they're doing to their customers for a variety of reasons. But one of them is, you're buying this ideal. Do you really want to be thinking about the destruction of the planet while you're,
sure.
You know? So we do a lot without communicating to the customers what we're doing. And I think one thing you always have to keep in mind is that the product has to be of great quality. And so a challenge we're facing right now with a lot of the bio-based raw material alternatives is they're not yet there, and we have to work with them quite a bit to make sure we're getting to that quality, because you cannot offer your customers something that's substandard, and they will be ready to switch if you're offering them something great, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Anybody want to come in on that? Because you guys all sort of look at what business is doing from the outside. Is the apparel, the clothing business a leader at the moment? Or where would you look within industry for really very positive stories about the degree to which they get the need to pursue initiatives and innovation in biomaterials and really deliver on sort of the sustainability agenda?
Well, if I look at our portfolio, I would say packaging would be one of the leading sectors in this particular area. And we're talking about food packaging, but all sorts of types of packaging actually for many different types of products. And we have several examples of demonstration actions or demonstration projects in our portfolio that are actually piloting at the moment food packaging in supermarket shelves, and it seems to be going quite well. I can name Fresh, for instance, but many other. But I think the textile industry is going to be also a leading segment, also because they have a huge outreach. Actually, the market is enormous in itself, and I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And what I wanted to highlight as well through our portfolio, and also in the updated CIRA that has been developed by our private partner, there's been a very strong focus recently on not just developing bio-based products or materials or compounds that are just alternatives to the fossil-based ones, to drop-ins, but really have improved functionalities, better quality features, precisely so that we can offer to the consumers and the citizens eventually something that is of high standard. So there's the focus on better, on improved products is actually
I mean, that seems to be crucial. You don't want the message to the consumer to be, well, this is second best, but at least you can feel good that it's more sustainable. I mean, you could try that as a message, but it's not necessarily going to work very well.
No, absolutely. And I think there's probably a cost related to that, right? So the bio-based alternative has to be competitive as well. So with that, what extra cost, whatever comes, better functionality or some other, let's say, add-ons are important to bring to the table, I would say.
I don't know who wants to take this on, but how does Europe compare with other parts of the world? You know, whether one thinks the United States, whether one thinks of China, or the big economic powerhouses of our world today. Where is Europe when it comes to both the climate for innovation and the commitment to delivering on, you know, sort of biomaterials as a means of meeting sustainability targets? Are we leaders or are we not?
Yeah, I would say that at this point in time, the European Union definitely is a leader in this specific sector, in the bio-based economy sector. And when we look at the policies, etc., that we observe in the European Union, they are different than the policies that we observe in the United States, Latin America, or China, with a very strong focus on stimulating investments into the bioeconomy. Now,
but let me interrupt. I just happened to speak to somebody outside who couldn't be here this afternoon, but she was somebody who works in venture capital and investment, and she said, you know, compared with the United States, the problem here is that there are loads and loads of little companies working, you know, on relatively small projects in this bio space, whereas in the United States, they seem much better at coalescing around perhaps a smaller number of projects, but with much bigger money backing them, and therefore they can scale up quicker. Does that ring true to you?
The investment environment in the United States is definitely a little bit different than the investment environment that we observe here in the European Union. But when you look at the investments being done in the bioeconomy, they look different in the United States than compared to the European Union. It was mentioned already this morning that the bioeconomy in the United States is corn-based, right? but that is basically just going into biofuels and bioenergy production and not into other products, while Europe tries to develop products that go beyond these bioenergy sectors. Now, for the investments in these products, that might be difficult to immediately scale it up because it is so much case specific. So you need a lot of hundreds of thousands of ideas in the end to get something that might in the end really work. And from that perspective, I think Europe is doing it in the right way, trying to initiate a number of ideas and let all the fishes swimming in the pond, and then let's see who will be the one that might survive. In the United States, the culture is a little bit different, but I think it may not generate this culture that we observe here in the European Union. And
But the only question is whether we're any good at turning little fish into big fish.
I think the big fishes that we observe in the United States are not emerging in those areas that we would love to see it.
I see.
So they are emerging in other areas. For example, if we look into food substitutes, vegetable-based foods, if we look into food products derived from stem cell production, artificial meat, I think these are markets where the United States definitely are ahead of the European Union. But the question is, are these then the markets we also would like to go into? And the question is then, if those markets will take over, what might this imply then for the European Union? So if we get more of these kind of food products entering the market. And within that debate, then the bioeconomy becomes even more important to provide alternatives just for producing food. And then in the end, alternatives for farmers using the natural resources, not only for agricultural products where we observe some kind of urbanization of agricultural production, with the trends that I have already mentioned, we observe this is going to happen in urban and peri-urban areas. So there is the question then, what is left for agriculture in the rural areas? And I think there is where the bioeconomy can really play a very important role. And that needs to be stimulated within the European Union. And I think we are there on the right path. Nevertheless, there are definitely a number of issues that can be improved upon, and this has been mentioned in the morning already with respect to regulatory issues. I think that is where the policymakers have a task upon them to make it more interesting for the private sector to invest more in these specific niche products, maybe also large-scale products.
Yeah, we did discuss that, and I'm delighted if people want to discuss that further. Yes, of course.
Can I just very quickly compliment to, I think I've heard echoes from public funders from countries like Canada who've said, you know, we have money to spend on the bioeconomy, but we cannot find projects. So they come to BBI and they ask, how do you put these people together?
Right.
And so I think it is very important to think how these public-private partnerships can catalyze collaborations that would not have happened before. And I think we are certainly leading by applying that model in the current framework.
And so when all this Canadian money is looking for a home, how do you try and hook it up with particular projects in Europe? I mean, how does it work?
They have to come to Europe.
Well, I figured you'd be encouraging them to come to Europe. I got that much.
But also there is another point that goes back to bioeconomy in the rural areas, for example, and the agricultural context as well, and potentially also forestry, which is the fact that we also need to try and understand what are the needs of the bioeconomy in local areas and more specific regions there, not only looking at the very big scale projects or scaling up, but also what are the needs more specifically at local level that needs to be addressed via the bioeconomy anyway. And some of the work we are doing at this stage is very much looking at, for example, how rural development programs within the common agricultural policy can help, particularly upskilling workers, bringing people together. So beyond actually the investments per se in terms of funding and monetary investments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked too much into the specifics of rural economy, but it seems to me, you know, the message at an event like this is all about how, you know, the bio-based economy is going to be so great for neglected rural areas, and it's going to boost employment, and it's going to give farmers a new lease of life. The danger is, you know, you look at other parts of the world which have devoted the rural economy to bio-based products. I mean, thinking of Indonesia and palm oil, for example, and the result, to many people's eyes, is disastrous.
Yes.
You know, how can we ensure we don't have a European equivalent of the palm oil disaster?
Yeah, I mean, the palm oil disaster is partly driven by Indonesia having detrimental practices, but it's also partly driven by Europe, very much by Europe and Europe consumption. So obviously, well, part of the bio-based economy development is going to be also changing production and consumption patterns as well in Europe. So really changing the way we produce the products, which is partly done in the bio-based context, but also in terms of demand. So what type of product we need. And we are also used to demand because that's how it's always been. There are different ways of changing, obviously, demand, but also changing production. But that's certainly one of the key elements. It's the consumption side, so changing the patterns there.
Right. So you have to, you know, at an event like this, you have people who are obviously running businesses in the bio space, but you also have researchers, you have scientists, you have academics, but you need, as part of this sort of idea of stakeholders, you need farmers on board, you need consumers on board, you need to bring all of these different people into the debate. And I just wonder how successfully you do get, you know, farmers and consumers to engage with quite a detailed discussion of what the bioeconomy means.
Currently, we actually have a project specifically on that, so bringing farmers in the bioeconomy debate and in the bioeconomy space as well, and this is with the European Network for Rural Development, which is part of DG Agri, and there the discussion we are having at this stage is very much trying to understand local needs, because we need to understand what farmers need as well, and how they can get into this wider debate. And it's very much, in certain cases, providing advice or upskilling, you know, their knowledge on what the bioeconomy can provide, or where the bioeconomy can add value to rural areas and their business, more specifically. And the rural development programs can do that. So there are measures that can be used for that purpose.
Right.
Yes, as an economist, I would say it's very much driven on the economic environment that local areas will face. So as long as you will be able to make a profit, then these products will also reach the markets. I'm quite convinced by that. The question is what are the roles of government and other stakeholders in generating, let's say, an environment where this is going to happen. Again, then I come back to the policy area, but also to really create a competitive environment where new ideas can flower. Right? And then it's difficult to forecast which idea in the end will make it, but I'm quite sure, and the experiences from other places show us, and one or the other idea will in the end make it and will become a very important technology, for example, that may then dominate the market, which does not necessarily imply it will be dominated by one company. It might be a technology that will be applied by several companies. If you look, for example, into the United States with the corn market and the the production of bioenergy there at the beginning, the investments in those facilities was not profitable. It was substantially subsidized. But then over time, people became more efficient, improved, etc. Now, at least they can compete at market prices. And when I look now at the policies that we observe in the European Union with its flagship programs, I think that is something similar. You invest in some bigger projects to try out what may work, what may not work, to try to improve on this, and then hopefully then in the end one or the other idea may flourish and will be profitable and be taken up at larger scale.
Can I bounce off of that, what Justus said there? So, because there are, I think, a proliferation of different accelerators and incubators coming up. So it's not the government are doing this, but in the US, you were talking about differences in EU and US. In the US, biotech is huge, and so you have a lot of biotech accelerators where you have 10 or 15 startups that go through a program for 3 months and get investment, et cetera. So I think that's a real key. We have one for sustainable fashion in Amsterdam called Fashion for Good. And there are a number of corporate partners. We're 13 corporate partners. There's Adidas, there's Target, Bestseller, Stella McCartney, Zalando, so a great number, as well as suppliers. And so we're able to say, okay, let's go out, let's scout, and let's see the startups that are doing great work, and then let's get them into this accelerator. We actually have an early stage and a later stage one, and a lot of them are obviously doing bio-based products. So it might be mushroom leather, leather made from apple skin. It might be resins made from organic waste. It might be biotech dyes. But we're seeing a lot. So I think there's a real opportunity just also within this more entrepreneurial startup space to be able to make those connections with brands and with investors as well.
What can you make out of apple skin?
Leather.
Leather?
Called frumat, yeah.
My shoes could be apple skin. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Everybody, did you notice the light show earlier was rather dramatic? I don't know what was going on, but it did remind me that we've got a wonderful audience here, and I've been talking enough. I should stop asking questions and get you guys, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, anything for any members of our panel, let's go for it. We've got quite a lot of time, so I'd love to get you all involved now. So, sir, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to start with you. We need to get the microphones to you, or a microphone, which is on its way, so off you go.
I have a question about pricing. So this morning we heard that consumers would prefer to buy sustainable products, but they're not necessarily willing to pay a higher price for it. But we also heard that pricing mechanisms may work to the advantage of established products, which are entrenched anyway and have that advantage to begin with. So, when you have a more sustainable product, would it not be logical to then also calculate the full price of less sustainable products? I mean, do people who buy products that, for instance, put carbon into the atmosphere have to be charged for the carbon they put into it and all the environmental effects of this? If you put a liter of petrol or oil into a product, do you have to pay for replacing the liter of oil? Because it took tens of millions of years to produce that oil. So I don't think we can replace it, at a reasonable cost. So actually the oil that you pay for $60 a barrel, if you calculate the full replacement cost, would be many times over that. So if you price products using the same standards, would not the sustainable products automatically become less expensive?
Yeah. Personally, I like that thought and question very much, because it seems to me, you come to an event like this and there's so much discussion of how to provide carrots in terms of incentives and incentives for innovation and government and state help and, BBI, JU's involved in all sorts of sort of stakeholder initiatives. But isn't the simple truth that the easiest way to encourage the bio industries, for example, is to have much more punitive taxation of carbon? And then you'd have to worry much less about all these initiatives that you guys launch, because the market, if carbon were really taxed more punitively, i.e. if there was more focus on the sticks than the carrots, the market would generate these innovations just because it would be an obvious commercial advantage.
I'll just say a quick word, and I think I will hand over to Justus, because I think you should comment on the economic aspect of that question. I think certainly incentives are very much welcome, all sorts of incentives that can help the more rapid market uptake of these alternatives. But one of the reasons why initiatives like BBI were put together in the first place was because a lot of the sectors or actors that need to work together to make these innovations happen simply didn't even talk to each other before. So the agri sector did not really think about doing products from the waste residues for packaging or other types of applications. And somehow this initiative has catalyzed that.
I get that. I don't mean to attack BBI.
No, certainly, no.
But I'm just interested in the point that maybe more focus should be put on getting a real price put on the petroleum-based products and everything that goes with them in terms of their emissions, pollution, etc.
Yeah. I think we need complementarity to really maximize the impact that we can accomplish. So complementarity of many different measures. So one initiative or one incentive on its own won't do it.
Right.
It's far too complex question.
Yes, you've got to come at it from both sides. Go on.
Yeah, I would agree. Swarm of bees approach is good. But I would also say that there is sort of an indirect tax or penalty that's coming because investors are paying so much attention to all of these issues now with ESG investing that they're constantly asking what percentage of your revenue is due to this or to that, and they will pull out if they don't like the way that you're doing your business. So, you know, it's happening in different ways already, this sort of penalty or negative reinforcement for doing business the wrong way. But I agree, it would be great if, I mean, historically companies have not been including their externalities in the price of their business, and that's been the issue, and now we're all paying for it. So.
But I mean, you know, going back to the question, and a real price being put on petroleum-based products, for example, I mean, you go into any clothing store, or just think about the clothing space, you can buy polyester-based clothing for literally, you know, pennies in most parts of the developed world. So there isn't any realistic price being put on extracting that petroleum and making that product.
No, and often it's a sustainable product which is more expensive, which is the exact opposite of what we should be doing.
So, so when is that fundamental shift going to take place?
I don't know.
I think it's already taking place. So first of all, I think when we look at pricing, we have to consider that we are not living in an apolitical world. A number of the externalities already are priced in. Look at the taxes you have to pay on your gasoline. We can debate whether or not the taxes that we observe that we pay on gasoline are high enough, whether or not that is really covering the extra costs. But definitely a number of environmental externality, or almost all of them, are to a certain extent already internalized. So the question is, at what level should we like to change policies to improve the current situation? And there, I think that, again, goes back to the policy environment. That is mainly in the hand of the policy makers. And basically, that means it's also in the hand of us, because we are the ones responsible also for the policy makers that we having governing us. So we go every year or every fourth year to the ballot station and vote for someone. And I think that is...
the bad news, Justus, is we don't always vote rationally on issues like that. We vote on a whole raft of things which may be nothing to do with sustainability.
Yeah, but still, in the end, it's our decision. So it's also up to us to decide what we want. So I think, putting this all together, I think market prices at this point in time are a very good indicator also for sustainability, as a number of externalities have already been internalized. So if you have products that are more costly than other products, that at first from an economist indicates there might be more resources being used to produce a specific product than the alternative one. And then we can, in a second step, assess, if we talk about a bio-based product that is more expensive, whether or not there are additional environmental benefits that have not yet at this stage being internalized. But there we have to be very careful, and assessing internalization is not a trivial task. As I has already mentioned, measuring greenhouse gas emissions is not trivial. If it would be trivial, we would not be having a big debate about this.
It will also take time, because we need to have studies from these new products that are being developed, LCA work that we can really start using, so we can extrapolate to the bigger picture.
Which comes back to our opening about measurement and how it's done, and yeah. Okay, terrific. Well, let's have more thoughts from our audience. Great, we've got one there and one there, so we'll start. There's a microphone right next to you, sir, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. My name's Nicholas Wallace. I'm a journalist at Science Business.
Hold, if you wouldn't mind, sir, hold the mic very close to your mouth so we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. I said my name's Nicholas Wallace. I'm a journalist at Science Business. My question is really for Justus, but everybody else is welcome to answer it if they want. You said a little bit earlier that when we were talking about big fish and small fish, that in the United States, the big fish are emerging in areas where we might not want them to, and you gave the examples of food derived from stem cell production and artificial meat. So my question is, why wouldn't you want big fish in those areas, and why wouldn't Europe want a piece of that action?
Okay. No, I just...
Did everybody hear the question, pretty much? Yes? Good.
So the question, I may just repeat, was about the big fish and the production of artificial meat that we observe as
which you said, you know, it happens in the United States, but we wouldn't necessarily want to see a massive.
No, yes, exactly. I phrase this as a question. So sometimes we have technological developments in other parts of the world that we may say, okay, that is nice that they do this, but that is not our cup of tea. And for example, artificial meat, that is something that is already, in quotation marks, relatively developed in the United States with a few big companies there. And then the question is, if Europe wants to enter into this game, does it at this stage make sense to enter this game when already a number of few big players are already there? So if you have some big fishes already swimming around, do you want to enter this pond and become a big fish yourself? Or would it not be better then to try to figure out, identify something else? So that basically is why I raise this as a question, not saying that I'm against the production of this kind of meat products. In the end, for me, it will depend how they will taste, what kind of resources will they use for this. From an animal welfare point of view, that might be great to observe from an environmental perspective. Perhaps the inputs being used and the emissions being generated might be much lower than using conventional meat. So from an environmental perspective, this may look great, but is there still a market for European companies to invest in this area? That is what I just put as a question mark.
Well, I'd have thought there is, surely. I mean, maybe this isn't a very good analogy, but I mean, if the Chinese, if Alibaba and the guys behind it had said, oh, there's already Amazon in the United States and they can move into China and da-da-da, you know, these huge Chinese tech corporates have proven that, you know, they can compete with and often become bigger and better than their US counterparts. You know, why can't Europe develop its own bio industry in the artificial meat business?
They may. Using the Alibaba example, you have to observe that China is not an open market.
No, there is that.
But Europe and the United States or the Western world is a relatively open market, so where free flow of products, almost in quotation marks, with all the trade disputes that we have in Texas, etc. But where technologies more or less flow between the different regions. So there you have to be a little bit more careful where you would like to put your money into. So that is what I was just mentioning, and that's why I put this into question. I'm not saying that Europe might not have a chance, but there might be other opportunities for investments that might look better, right? And that is what I like to stress.
Okay, I understand. Did that satisfy you, that answer? Yes, it did. Good, excellent. Where was the question over here? You, sir.
I would like to come back for a moment on the carbon tax. My name is Anton Robeck, and it is specifically a question for Christine. Apparently, Kering has developed a methodology to put a value to the environmental impact of your products. Can you share with us what would be a typical range in this ticket per unit of carbon that you use?
Yes, this refers to the environmental profit and loss, the EP&L that I mentioned in my intro. So that's putting a monetary amount on everything we create. So what we'll do is say we want to look at a kilo of cotton that Saint Laurent sourced. We can say which country and where did it go after that, and track it through, and then develop the amount. But it's using 6 primary indicators, carbon being one of those. So I can't just pull and I mean I don't have it in my mind. We have like 1 million data points, so it's not something that I could pull out and say it's worth $5 or something like that. But we do have all the data back there. And we've tried to actually open source as much of this as possible, and there's now a software platform that's been launched as well. So we talk to companies very frequently about whether if they want to try to do an EP&L, how we can share that information with them as well so that they can develop their own. So also this idea of everyone can measure something any way they want. If there's a way that we can harmonize this, and if other companies want to try to measure in the same way, then we're happy to try to help them do that. But it does help us make decisions on, we can run simulations and say, okay, well, if we want to use wool, if we source the wool from New Zealand versus Patagonia, what is that going to do to the EP&L value? And then we can see which one is better, which one has less impact, for example.
But do you think we're approaching the day, is it possible to imagine the day where you go into a store, for argument's sake, a clothing store, and you look at the sticker price on a garment, but it also has a breakdown of the specific sort of carbon cost of producing this particular garment, so that, you know, there is a transparency and accountability there
Definitely.
for the customer.
Yeah, that's happening more and more, especially with blockchain, not just within apparel, but across different sectors. Food and Whole Foods, you can do that actually. You can scan a product, you can see where it's been, and I think they do environmental. I don't know if it's only carbon or not. But yes, I think that's beginning. You're beginning to see that
right,
on the
and
market.
then the challenge would be to standardize that so that, you know, you could compare and contrast with products from all over the world.
Well, you would hope that the way they're calculating their carbon is already based off one of the standards of how you do that measurement.
Well, you hope so, but
you would hope so, and they would probably say this is, I don't know, VCS or whatever.
But that kind of, I don't know, in the end we're talking about global standardization. You'd want to know that the Chinese were being as straightforward. I mean, I'm not picking on the Chinese. You want to know the Europeans are as being as honest as any other part of the world. You know, is it possible to imagine that kind of global standardization, transparency?
Well, this is something we were talking about earlier, because we were talking about regulation and how that's difficult. Is there also a role for private sector to form working groups around different sectors like apparel, pharma, automobiles, around bio-based, what that means, because we do have standards that exist already for organic cotton, which are international, the GOTS standard, for example. So it actually doesn't work in China. They don't accept it. That's the only country, I think, where it doesn't work. But in most places, it's recognized internationally, or Blue Sign, and so it might already exist that people are including the bio-based standards into some of these other overarching certifications that exist. But, you know, I think there's a bigger role that the private sector could play with groups like the BBI and other experts and NGOs to make sure that is being included for maybe for what already exists too.
Anything we're going to say?
Yeah, what I want to say also in the context of the future framework program and what the future partnerships of these public-private collaborations should look like, I think there's going to be a stronger focus on that, not just, you know, investing in the R&I, but really creating all the conditions possible to help this ecosystem really flourish. And I think standards and regulation, consumer awareness, education, all these other horizontal, let's say, activities will be of a paramount importance to make sure that this really happens quickly.
Good, okay. I'm going to come to you, sir, but I want to make sure I get to the back as well. So if you've got questions at the back, do stick your hand up. So we've got one there. So we'll come to you, and then to you, sir, near the front. But we'll go to the back first.
Yeah, hello, my name's Kathleen Garnett from Wageningen University.
Again, if you wouldn't mind, ma'am, just...
Sorry,
yep, there you go.
Kathleen Garnett from Wageningen University, the law school. And I have a question for Christine, because you said right at the beginning that you thought that biosynthetics was the future. My question is, do you think that's a contradiction in terms?
Yeah, I didn't mean to say biosynthetics is the future. So if I did that, I misspoke. I think natural fibers are amazing, and we love leather, and we love wool and silk and cashmere, and we want to continue to do that under the right and best conditions. We do have to find alternatives to all the synthetic fibers that we have that are made from petroleum. So my point is more, if 65% of what we're sitting in now is probably virgin polyester, how do we fix that as well? And for that...
It's just that I appreciate that you're in a very high-end market that probably most people couldn't afford, and that if you want to go for the mass market, you have to go for something cheaper, which will probably be another synthetic solution. So you might say, for example, we'll go for the apple leather, which sounds good in a small market, but the moment you scale it up... Sorry, can you hear me?
No, I can't.
It's difficult, but I think sort of, yeah.
You were talking about apple leather,
apple leather,
apple
yes.
leather for shoes, for example, that, you know, that might work for a very niche market, but if you want to go for a mass market, let's say Primark is going to do, or COS or Zara, is it then going to become environmentally unfriendly? How can you maintain that bioethic when you go for the mass market? That's what I'm...
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think it kind of goes back to this question of scale. We don't want to create another palm oil issue, right? I think that's what you mean. If the feedstock we're relying on becomes too important, what is that going to mean? Is that part of it? Because if you look at H&M, they're including orange fiber, so that's orange peel, pineapple leather from the pineapple stock, and an algae foam in their conscious collection this season. So it is in the mass market. It's hitting the mass market. Frumat, the one I mentioned, is working with a large automobile company and furniture companies. So it's happening. But yes, I think whenever you're analyzing some of these new technologies, you have to say, what are they sourcing from? And if this goes big, is that an issue? And you know, how much banana fiber already exists? What's happening to the waste that already exists? If they're taking the waste, is it going to? If it scales, like how much room is there for it to scale without creating some sort of negative impact?
But I think underpinning the question too is a thought about whether, you know, for all of this debate that we have at forums like this about, you know, the absolute righteousness of moving to a bioeconomy, the poor and the disadvantaged people who rely on shops like Primark, one in the UK, to buy, say, a school uniform for their kids, which costs £10 as opposed to the much finer natural product that might cost £100, where are they, you know, are they still going to be able to get the really cheap £10 school uniform in a world where petroleum-based products have been removed?
No, it's a good point, and I think you want this to be democratized, obviously, and it is, as I said, in H&M. So I think they're eating some of the margin right now, most likely. I don't know, but yeah, I think you have to balance a number of factors. How much can the brand itself absorb so that the consumer doesn't have to pay for it? That's done quite a lot with sustainability products. The cost isn't passed on to the consumer, but it's absorbed by the brands. You have to look at over time. It's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to replace petroleum products tomorrow. So can you achieve those economies of scale in the meantime in 10, 15 years so that there's price parity, you know, as you're phasing out more of the petroleum-based product?
I know there was a question from the gentleman there, and then, ma'am, we'll get to you.
Thank you. My name is Jose Jimenez. I work in the European Commission, and I have a couple of questions for the BBI representative here. It's about numbers, indeed. I mean, two questions, very short ones. One is about the whole story about decarbonization. You are, of course, assuming to have to contribute to the goals of the EU bioeconomy strategy by reducing by 50% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That is the statement that is clearly in your brochure. My question is directly to the members of the BBI themselves. Of course, this is a general target, but the members of the BBI, the industries which are part of that, how are they directly contributing to this? Are they measuring their reduction of emissions themselves in this particular goal, directly themselves, not as a sector? And if they do, what is the projection? Are they in the right track to get to 50% reduction by 2030? Or is something that we need to wait a bit longer? That's one question. And
well, hang on, sir. Let's deal with one at a time, if we may. Otherwise, we'll forget them. So, Eleni, can you answer that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. Of course, the targets for the BBI initiative were quite ambitious. What I would like to say is that we do have these targets are actually translated into requirements for every single project that we finance. And so for the, especially the innovation actions, so demos and flagships, we are expecting reductions of emissions, and we want those projects actually to carry out LCA studies to prove that. But all of our portfolio is quite, it's still ongoing actually, so we don't have outputs of those LCA studies quite yet, but we do have reports of expected outputs which show that we are on the right track. But we need to validate all this at the end of the life cycle of the projects we have financed, and that will start coming, I think, from next year onwards, and we will actually launch a study to start looking into that in more detail.
Okay, no, in the same question, my question was not about the projects that you're funding, was about the industries which are members of the BBIs, which are themselves emitting greenhouse gases, independently of the project they're running. If they themselves, as members of the BBI, are computing their emissions, and they have incorporated this goal of reduction in their own industrial productions. I'm not talking about the BBI projects, you understand?
Okay, but maybe I can complement my answer by saying, first of all, I cannot answer for every single industry member that is part of big bio-based industries consortium. In our projects, we have big and non-big beneficiaries. But I am very much aware that the entire industry has incorporated, let's say, sustainability thinking into their practices. And I am familiar with practices, for example, of Corbion and DSM and Novozymes that have taken very serious look at that and have actually set targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions in their agenda. So I think the industries are looking into that very seriously. So I perhaps I see big members here who could also comment in more detail.
Well, we could pick that up during coffee. I am mindful we're almost out of time now. So could we get the microphone to your colleague there? You, ma'am, give us your question.
Thank you so much. Lene Lange, I'm from Denmark and Vice Chair of Scientific Committee of BBI. I have a good message, because actually we are much longer. So it's not just for the niche markets and people who are ready to pay a lot of money. You can use the one for apple and for orange and for pineapple. It's actually possible to use industrial pulp, which is a raw material which is now only used for biogas or actually rotting somewhere and polluting the environment. So the raw material is available.
Sorry, ma'am, you can use this fruit pulp for what?
For making what we just talked about, for making orange peel and the pulp of juice
yeah,
production.
but to make what? You don't want to make orange pulp, you want to make something.
No, I was just referring to the discussion you had just
No,
had.
I know, but what can you make? Shoes, clothes? What
you can make T-shirts from the industrial orange pulp.
Right.
You can make leather from pineapple and so on. So it's doable. The other part of making very cheap and excellent out of the one where we get from fossil sources now, you can produce, microbes can produce exact same molecules as now we get from fossils. The other part is that we can use CO2 and methane to produce the type of materials we now get for fossils. So we can take down the lost emissions which are making all this trouble, which can take them down, carbon capture, and use a windmill electricity as energy, and make what we before got from fossils. It's doable. There's so much which can be done now, and it's not just for the niche markets.
Wow. Well, yes. No, that's uplifting. Thank you very much. Did anybody want to continue with the uplifting?
I agree. I mean, we're seeing so many innovations, and it's incredibly exciting. And I think you're referring to Mango Materials converts methane into polyester. We're seeing algae fibers. We're seeing algae dyes. You know, I mentioned biotech dyes. I mean, there's a lot happening. I will say there are a few hurdles that we need, challenges. One is a lot of them are very early stage, so it's great that H&M has a few of these new innovations in their collections now, but a lot of them are early stage, so they need a lot of work, and it's a real exchange with brands and suppliers on what's needed. A lot of them aren't plug-and-play solutions. You have to maybe change processes and the way they're done, so you have to get your suppliers included, potentially change infrastructure, which is never easy. And then we need the investment, because they're long-term. You know, they take years sometimes for the R&D to get to a level where you can go out to the market. So how do we get those investors in? So.
Yeah,
but
good.
I agree,
all right.
the
Well,
future is bright.
I always love a bit of uplifting commentary before we end the panels. That's very good. I don't know if there's any question anybody still wants to ask, because we've got time for one more if it's brief and to the point. So if anybody would like the last question, again, I'm being the auctioneer, going. At the back, good. I can't see you at the back, but you're the outsiders, you're the exiles, but nonetheless, you are allowed to speak, so speak now. A microphone is coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis.
Again, hold the microphone really close to you because we can't hear you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
Good evening, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epaphos Advisors. We represent here the EcoWaves movement, the pan-European and Mediterranean movement, which is based in direct democracy, in science and in ecology. As you understand, we support bio-based solutions. The question is, as this session is about the citizens, what are you doing about the citizens? Because we are proposing from 2015 to the Commission and to the Union the education. Without education, we cannot promote our policies, our wills. So the bio solutions must be on the ground levels of the citizens to understand what is this. Because the citizens, they are sleeping in another world.
Right, okay. Yeah, it's an important point to end on. You know, we have a lot of discussion, but how do we ensure that this is a citizen-driven movement as well as business, scientists, experts, think tankers? How do we truly engage and ensure that citizens are at the heart of this?
I can say a quick word also. I invite you to go out and visit projects that are exhibiting here today, financed by us and some also financed by other parts of Horizon 2020, that are dealing precisely with this question, that are aiming at educating, training the trainers, educating younger generation, going to schools and talking about the bioeconomy, developing tools that can be used to train youngsters and consumers in different ways. So I can mention Your BioFuture, I can mention BioCanDo, I can mention many other projects which are here today. So the program, at least BBI, is very conscientious about this issue, and it is very much embedded in the horizontal actions that we finance. And our private partner as well is actually very active in the area of education, also even launching student prizes for the bioeconomy. So there's many different ways to address this, by supporting curricula, by supporting the development of masters in the bioeconomy area, but also going really to vocational training. So there's many different initiatives going on.
Yeah, very, very briefly, because we're out of time. Anybody else, do you think citizens are truly engaged in this? And
Well, I was going to say, I think the BBC could do a good job in helping the citizens understand the bioeconomy. No, but seriously, with this Blue Planet, that Sir David Attenborough, I mean, that was like an overnight change for people to see that. And now the BBC has a conscious clothing line that they've developed with Mother of Pearl. I mean, the power that media outlets have. So maybe there should be a nice documentary about bio-based economy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, because obviously consumers are the ones actually purchasing, bio-based product, but in many cases they don't know, the details and what's particularly the added value of such products as well to the wider society. So I think there is a question of transparency as well, and particularly communicating to consumers beyond education, but also really what's the added value of a bio-based product compared to also a fossil-based one. So there is it's a very important point what was raised.
Right, I agree. And on that note, I think we're going to have to stop. There's a message on my screen saying time is up, ! Which means, ladies and gentlemen, coffee is going to be served outside. But before we go, please give our panel a very big thank you. Panelists, thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Thank you. No, you're welcome. Thank you. See you soon.